Hey everyone, it's Dave here. Got my new scarf on. The sun's out. It's a gorgeous day. Just on the cusp of a very, very cold outbreak in the next few days. So I've got my fingers crossed for some snow. Don't know whether I ever mentioned that I love snow. So fingers crossed we get some snow. Anyway, vulnerability is the topic of today's video. Are you vulnerable, or are you vulnerable? The power of words. And one of the things I love about the English language is not only that words can have different the same word can have different meanings, but the context behind the word can impart different meanings, as in the case of the word vulnerable. We live in a time where excuse me, we live in a time where I question the validity of the concept that the British people are stoic. I really do have called that into question now. Whether they're stoic and whether they're sensible as well. This is one of the ideas behind the British psyche, is that the British people are stoic and that they are sensible. And I think, looking back through history, they've certainly shown that. Look back to the Second World War for an example of stoicism, and look back to the fact that, you know, we don't elect extremist parties to parliament. Some people may disagree with that, but anyway, we also live in an age where the population is mollycoddled. We live effectively in a nanny state, and we have done for a number of years now, maybe a couple of decades. You know, a society where increasingly the population is expectant of the government to look out for their health, look out for their financial security, and generally to provide a blueprint for them for how to live their lives. And the result of that is the idea of individual sovereignty is under threat. I talk about the word vulnerable because I feel now that so many people in society, set against that background, are now classing themselves as vulnerable, largely because they've been told to by the government and by the media. So we all know what's happened in the last 11 months, and we know that millions of people have been told they are in the vulnerable category and that they should adjust their lives accordingly, their behaviours accordingly. And what we have seen is a large-scale social re-engineering of society based largely on the fact that many people now see themselves as too vulnerable to take on the challenges of life. There are unbelievably still people who haven't left their homes, fit and healthy people who haven't left their homes since March 2020. I don't know how to describe that. Sometimes I think it's pathetic, and I don't mean pathetic, I mean it's sad. It's certainly sad. It's misguided. It's tragic, because we live on a planet that, as far as our greatest scientists and minds are able to determine, is the only planet with life in an infinite universe. And we're only here for a stitch in time, set against the grand scheme, the eons of time itself. The universe has existed for 14 billion years. We get to experience this thing called life for a mere blip. 80 years, 90 years if we're lucky. There's nothing, absolutely nothing, as I'm sure that most people would attest to. Time flies after all, and it does, doesn't it? Yeah, set against that, you're right, fact is the fact that many people are literally putting their lives on hold because they've been told to by the state and by the media. And that's what I find deeply disturbing and sad. And one of the cruelest aspects to what the propagandists have done, not just in this country, but in many other countries across the world, is that they have managed to persuade people to indoctrinate people to look upon the concepts of life and death completely differently. i.e., life is not worth living and experiencing until all risk can be eliminated, which, of course, for any of us who have got half a brain, we know is impossible. So, for anybody out there who's classing themselves as vulnerable, I want to know why. Now, of course, vulnerable. If I or anybody goes out in a force 9 gale in the middle of winter when it's pouring down with rain with not adequate clothes on, you know, I'm vulnerable to the elements and I get hypothermia. If I take a risk, if I do a bungee jump, for example, or parachute jump, I'm vulnerable to the high risk of injury that entails. Of course, we are all vulnerable when we embrace risk. Risk is all around, and until this generation, all human generations seem to, as far as I can see, looking back into history, have been more emotionally mature with regard to accepting risk and tolerating risk and not letting that risk factor be the ultimate determinant of whether they're going to experience life or not, whilst at the same time may be able to protect those who genuinely are vulnerable. And this is why I get angry, because the people in our society who genuinely are vulnerable, and I'm not talking about anyone who's over 70 just by virtue of the fact that they're over 70. I am not talking about the teaching unions and the school teachers who are not going back to school because they say they're not feeling safe. And I know that doesn't apply to all teachers, and it's driven by the unions. I'm not talking about the healthcare workers who are getting media exposure and are told by the media that in doing their job they are vulnerable. I'm not talking about those, because no, they are not the truly vulnerable individuals in this world. The truly vulnerable individuals in this world, in our country, in our society, are the children who are being fed a diet of fear. The children who have been deprived of their safe environment at school. The children who maybe are being abused. The old people who have been abandoned, either to die in care homes or hospitals, or have been abandoned because their families have been unable to visit them. The truly vulnerable people with terrible, terrible mental health difficulties who have been abandoned by our society. What I wish everybody would do is, before classing yourself as vulnerable, ask, is that the correct word to describe you? Is that the correct word to describe you when set against a society and a world that actually put into perspective against other countries around the world and different periods in human history? Are you really vulnerable? Or are you just being a tad pathetic? Is hiding behind the couch at home, refusing to go out? Is that helpful to you as an individual? Is that helpful to society? And in doing that, are you detracting the conversation and distracting the conversation away from those in society who do need protecting, the truly vulnerable. One of my friends the other day made a really salient and prescient point. He said that the starkness in difference between many in society now when compared against our grandparents' experience in the Second World War. Both of my granddads were fighting, one in Europe, one in North Africa. Now they were vulnerable. Imagine that, fighting in a war you don't want to fight, knowing that at any time you could be riddled with bullets and die. They both survived the war. Two of many heroes in that period of recent history of ours. Were they vulnerable? Yes, they were vulnerable. They were vulnerable to being killed every time they stepped outside to fight. And those on the home front, my two nanas, enduring the Blitz, the bombs raining down in Liverpool. Liverpool was a badly affected city during the Second World War, very badly affected due to its coastal location. My nanas used to occasionally tell me about what it was like having the bombs raining down, hearing them in the distance and not knowing where they were going to fall. They just got on with it. They did their duty. They were stoic. I used to be astounded actually at the kind of like the way they would tell the stories, as if it was, we just had to do it. Wow, were they vulnerable? Absolutely. Did they class themselves as vulnerable? No, they had a sense of duty. And an emotional intelligence, I would suggest, as well. And a perspective. I also have another friend who's actually appeared on my channel, Jim. I don't know whether you remember him, but we had a conversation and he made some valued contributions, Jim. The Jim has a whole myriad of health issues, and I mean, he really does. He's nearly died a few times. He has issues with his heart. He's on chemotherapy for his conditions that he has. He doesn't have cancer, but he has cancer drugs to treat his condition, which suppress his immune system severely. Does he label himself as vulnerable? No. Does he let what's going on and the government and media dictate his life? No, he doesn't. He accepts, yeah, he may be more at risk of catching an infectious disease than the average person, but he just cracks on because he understands that to be the best person in this world, not only for his family but for society in general, he needs to play an active role in society. And that right there is emotional intelligence, being able to accept risk. So there you go. Now, vulnerable can also have a completely different meaning. You can be vulnerable in a really positive and liberating way. So what does that mean? If you allow yourself to be vulnerable to the world, in terms of accepting the risk and embracing the risk and growth and learning, be open to growth and learning by, at least in part, embracing the risk that comes with that, by being authentic and being true to who you really are, expressing yourself in a way that you want to express yourself, by speaking your truth, by saying what you think, by acknowledging the challenges, suffering, occasionally catastrophe of this existence that we have, yet pushing back against that and offering your true, unbridled, authentic self to the world with all the risks that entails. And what are those risks? The risk of ridicule, risk of being castigated, risk of being ostracized, all of those things. phrase, "There are none so hated as those who tell the truth," comes to mind here. Being brave enough to be you, to face up to the challenges, to pick yourself back up off the floor, to not use excuses as to why you can't do something. And I say this because I spent most of my life, or a large part of my life, to not be a victim. I think, yeah, I did. And the day you choose to not be a victim anymore is the day that you begin your sense of liberation. And anybody, like I say, who's not playing a full role in society because they've been told to by the government and by the media, well, they're not being vulnerable in a positive sense. So that's what you can do by embracing risk, by being brave and courageous, by speaking truth. You leave yourself, you are vulnerable, but in a good way, in a positive way, and in a way that will give you a deep sense of meaning and purpose, and eventually thus a byproduct of happiness. That's where I'm at the moment. So vulnerability is not weakness if you don't let it be a weakness. Vulnerability is strength. Vulnerability is strength. The strength to acknowledge your own weaknesses. The strength to acknowledge that in spite of your weaknesses and your flaws, and the fact that you don't know half of what there is to know about, and this is all me, in spite of all that, you can still be of value to yourself, to others around you, and to society. And that is what we need in this society of ours now. People to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable, but to be vulnerable and strong. Not to be vulnerable and pathetic. And in doing so, we will once again then draw the attention to those in society who genuinely are vulnerable, who need our support, who need money and resources diverted towards them, and who need the conversation diverted towards them as well. So choose to be vulnerable. Are you vulnerable, or are you vulnerable? Let me know what you think of what I've said today in the comments. If you do like my content, please do subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. Great to speak to you as ever, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of my walk now, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.